The stranger did not ask how much a loaf of bread cost. He did not ask where the coffee was. Instead, he pointed to the worn notebook beside Margaret Hale's cash register. And he asked a question no customer had asked in years. How much do they owe you? Margaret slowly placed her hand over the book. Then she looked at the man, as if she had misunderstood him. If stories about ordinary people choosing kindness still mean something to you, stay with me, because this story begins with a little grocery store that almost everyone had forgotten. Margaret Hale was 69 years old. For most of her adult life, she had stood behind the same wooden counter at a little corner grocery on Willow Street. It was not a modern store, it was not fancy. The floorboards creaked near the freezer, the front door had a small brass bell, and it always rang a little too loudly. The produce section was small. Some prices were still written by hand. But years ago, the store had been full of life. Children stopped there after school. Older neighbors came in for milk and bread. Dakrants picked up something for dinner on their way home. Margaret knew almost everyone. She knew who liked strong coffee. She knew which customer always forgot the eggs. And she knew which older neighbors needed lighter grocery bags. Because carrying heavy ones had become difficult. Back then, the little store felt like part of the neighborhood. Not just a place to shop. A place where people knew one another. But neighborhoods change. Families moved away. People began shopping at larger stores outside town. Others started ordering what they needed from home. And little by little, Margaret's grocery became quieter. Then her husband passed away. After that, the silence inside the store felt different. He had always been there with her. He handled deliveries, he repaired broken shelves, he carried heavy boxes, and during the evening rush, he stood beside Margaret behind the counter. Now, she did everything alone. Margaret kept the store open because she still needed the income. But there was another reason. She simply could not imagine turning the key for the final time. Too many memories lived inside those walls. There was also something else, something most customers never knew about. Inside a drawer beneath Margaret's register was an old account book. For years, if a long-time customer was short on money, Margaret sometimes allowed them to take a few basic groceries home and pay later. Nothing expensive: bread, milk, soap, cereal, a few vegetables. Margaret simply wrote the amount beside their name. Most people came back and paid when they could, and Margaret never made anyone feel embarrassed. She never discussed their debt in front of another customer. She never placed their names on a notice. She never asked questions they did not want to answer. She simply kept the notebook closed whenever someone else came near the counter. But over the previous year, more balances had remained unpaid. Some customers had stopped coming back, not because they did not care. Some were simply having a difficult time, and some, Margaret suspected, were too embarrassed to face her. The unpaid balances slowly grew, and for a small store already struggling to survive, every dollar mattered. By late autumn, Margaret knew she could not continue much longer. So one Tuesday morning, she took out a small piece of paper. She wrote 4 words on it: closing at month's end. Then she placed it beside the register for the rest of the morning. Margaret tried not to look at it. Just after lunch, the brass bell above the door rang. A man Margaret had never seen before stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 50s. His name was Daniel Rowan. He wore a plain work jacket. Nothing about him suggested that he had come to do anything important. Daniel walked slowly through the aisles. He picked up a jar of coffee, then a loaf of bread. When he reached the counter, he noticed Margaret's sign. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked around the store. "You've been here a long time?" Margaret nodded. 38 years. Daniel looked toward the shelves. "My mother used to talk about a little grocery on Willow Street." Margaret smiled politely. Many people had memories of the store. She rang up his coffee and bread, but Daniel did not leave. His eyes had fallen on the worn notebook beside the register. Margaret had forgotten to put it away. Daniel pointed toward it. "What's that?" Margaret rested her hand on the cover. "Just old store accounts." Daniel became quiet. Then he said, "My mother had one of those here." Margaret looked up. Daniel told her his mother's name, June Rowan. Margaret's expression changed. She remembered her, a quiet woman, a mother raising 2 young children through several difficult years. And then, Margaret remembered Daniel too. Not as the man standing in front of her, but as a thin little boy who used to stand near the candy shelf, counting coins in the palm of his hand. Margaret opened the old ledger. She searched through several pages, then she smiled. "Your mother paid every penny." Daniel looked down at the counter. She always said somebody helped us when we needed it. Margaret shook her head gently. A lot of people helped each other back then, but Daniel knew, his mother had been talking about Margaret. His eyes moved toward the closing notice again, then, toward the ledger. There are still people in that book, aren't there? Margaret did not answer. Daniel lowered his voice. You don't have to tell me their names. That wouldn't be right, Margaret said. Daniel nodded. I agree. He waited for a moment, then he asked, just tell me one thing. Margaret looked at him. What is the total? Margaret gave a small nervous laugh. I'm not letting a stranger pay other people's grocery bills. Daniel smiled. You let my mother carry ours once. That was different. Daniel looked at her, probably not to her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Margaret looked down at the closed ledger. She knew the stories behind many of those unpaid balances. One belonged to a retired school custodian, adjusting to a smaller income. Another belonged to a young father, whose work hours had been reduced. Another belonged to an older woman, who had been helping care for her sister. They were not bad people. They were ordinary people, going through difficult seasons. Daniel reached into his jacket. He placed an envelope on the counter. Then he told Margaret why he had really come. His mother had passed away several years earlier, and while going through some of her belongings, Daniel had found a small handwritten note. It mentioned Margaret, and the little grocery on Willow Street. His mother had written that, when her children were young, there were evenings when she did not have enough money for groceries. Margaret had allowed her to take food home and pay later, but that was not the part June remembered most. What she remembered was that Margaret never made her feel ashamed. Daniel had wanted to visit the store ever since he found that note. He came hoping to say thank you. Nothing more. Then he saw the closing sign. Margaret pushed the envelope back toward him. Your mother didn't owe me anything. Daniel nodded. I know. Then he gently pushed the envelope toward Margaret again. That's why this isn't for her. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were beginning to fill with tears. Daniel pointed toward the ledger. It's for them. Margaret hesitated. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, without showing Daniel a single name, she calculated the total amount still owed. She wrote the number on a small piece of paper, then she turned it toward him. Daniel looked at the number. He did not look shocked. He did not ask which customer owed what. He simply nodded. All of it. Margaret stared at him. You don't even know these people. Daniel looked around the little grocery. No. Then he looked at the ledger again. But once, somebody here didn't really know me either. Margaret could not answer. She slowly sat on the stool behind the register. Then she covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel did not make a speech. He did not ask Margaret to take a photograph. He did not ask her to put his name in the window. He did not ask anyone to thank him. He simply paid the balance, every unpaid tab in the book. Then he picked up his bread and coffee, and walked toward the door. Margaret finally called after him. Daniel. He stopped, then turned around. Margaret looked at the ledger. What am I supposed to tell them? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Tell them their account was settled, by someone who remembered being helped. The brass bell rang and Daniel walked away. The next morning, Margaret called the first person in the ledger. His name was Arthur Mills. Arthur was a retired school custodian. He had been avoiding the grocery, because he was embarrassed about what he owed. When he answered the phone, Margaret said, Arthur, your grocery account is clear. There was silence, then Arthur said softly, I haven't paid you yet, I know. Margaret explained only what Daniel had allowed her to explain. Someone who had once received kindness in that store, had come back, and passed it on. Arthur came into the grocery that afternoon. He bought a carton of milk, and a small bag of apples. This time, he paid before leaving. He stood quietly beside the counter. I stayed away because I was ashamed, he admitted. Margaret looked at him, then she smiled. I wondered where you'd been. 2 days later, a young mother came back, then an older neighbor, then another former customer. Margaret never told anyone who else's had been in the ledger. She protected their privacy. She never told them more about Daniel than he wanted them to know. But word slowly moved through the neighborhood. Not the names, not the amounts, just one simple story. Someone had remembered what the little grocery once meant to his family. And because of that, the neighborhood began remembering too. The change was not sudden, there was no miracle, the store did not become crowded overnight, but over the next several weeks, small things began to happen. People who normally drove past started stopping once or twice a week. A former teacher began buying her Saturday newspaper there again. A father came in with his young daughter for bread and let her choose an apple. 2 teenagers from the neighborhood offered to help Margaret carry deliveries into the stockroom after school. And Arthur, the retired custodian, started coming by every Thursday morning. Sometimes he bought groceries, sometimes he simply fixed something that was loose. One morning, Margaret looked at the closing notice beside the register. She picked it up, she folded it once, then she threw it away. She decided to keep the store open. But things would be different. She opened a little later in the morning. She closed a little earlier in the evening. For the first time in months, the work felt manageable again. Margaret also retired the old unpaid-tab book. Not because she had stopped caring, she still cared deeply. She realized that one small struggling shop could not quietly carry every burden alone. So near the register, Margaret placed a small basket. There were no names on it, no long explanation. Customers who wished to help could quietly add a few dollars, and if someone was having a difficult week, they could quietly use a little of it. For basic groceries, no public list, no questions, no embarrassment. Some weeks, the basket held very little. Other weeks, it held enough, and every time Margaret looked at it, she remembered the stranger who walked into her nearly empty grocery and noticed a notebook everyone else had ignored. 3 months later, the brass bell above the door rang again. Margaret looked up. Daniel Rowan was standing there. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Daniel looked around. There were people in the aisles. Arthur was near the soup shelf, cheerfully arguing with Margaret about which kind was best. A little girl was choosing apples. Another customer was placing a few dollars into the small basket beside the register. Daniel smiled. "You kept it open." Margaret looked around her little grocery, then she shook her head. "No," she smiled. "We did." Sometimes, kindness does not return to us from the person we helped. Sometimes, it travels quietly, through years, through families, through strangers, until one day, it finds its way back. If this story touched you, comment, "Kindness lives here." And if someone once helped you during a difficult season, share that memory below, because you never know who might read your story. Remember a kindness they once received, and decide to pass it forward.